Hello, I am Surgeon General. We're in the final stretch before the launch of the new Path of Exile Challenge League, Curse of the Allflame. Accompanying the new season, Grinding Gear Games has announced a number of changes to core systems coming in patch 3.29, including a revamp of talismans, a massive change to the socket color system, and a way to transfer modifiers from one unique to another in the form of enshrouded and vestigial uniques from Legion. One of the less exciting, but still very impactful changes coming in the new patch is a rework of the mana cost system. Prior to patch 3.29, players had access to sources of reduced mana cost of skills. This stat was available on the passive tree, both through mana wheels such as Dreamer as well as the associated mana mastery, could be found in large quantities on unique items like Praxis and Honor Home, and was a craftable prefix option for rings at the crafting bench. However, in patch 3.29, all sources of reduced mana cost are being modified to instead grant the player increased mana cost efficiency. In general, this will make investments into mana costs more impactful at small investments, but make it impossible to reduce mana costs all the way to zero without flat reductions. While the PoE community generally understands the face value impacts of this rework, astute patch note readers may have noticed that there are no announced changes to uniques or passive skills that grant increased mana costs, implying that they will still be available in the game. Increased cost has the potential to interact with increased cost efficiency in some subtle ways, which are potentially enabling for a few niche mechanics. In this video, we'll dive into the math behind increased costs and increased cost efficiency to explore how the two will interact. We'll then quickly look at a number of mechanics which interact with skill costs to scale the player's damage to understand why we should care about manipulating skill costs as an enabler for niche builds. One caveat up front though. This analysis was done prior to the release of patch 3.29, and so these are just my educated guesses at how the announced mechanics will work. I obviously am not able to test these thoroughly. If I'm way off the mark, you have my permission to come back a week from now and tell me how wrong I was in the comments section, but for now, let's get into the mechanics. As previously mentioned, the old mana cost scaling system prior to patch 3.29 was based around increases and reductions, which always stack additively in Path of Exile. To find the final cost of a skill, you take the base mana cost and multiply it by 1 plus the sum of all increased and reduced cost modifiers. This means that, as shown in this chart, there was a linear relationship between the amount of skill cost reduction a player had and the final multiplier applied to their costs. This type of relationship heavily incentivized stacking skill cost reduction because it had increasing marginal returns. By this, I mean that as you stacked more sources of cost reduction, each subsequent point gained created a larger drop in the cost multiplier than the point before. As an example, consider a character that has no sources of increased or reduced skill costs. They're at 0% on this chart and their mana cost multiplier is 1. If they then took the Dreamer node for 10% reduced mana costs, they move to the right on this chart and their mana cost multiplier drops from 1 to 0.9, a 10% drop. However, compare this to a different hypothetical character that already stacked sources of reduced mana costs up to 90%. They are on the right of this chart with a mana cost multiplier of 0.1. If they then took the Dreamer node for an additional 10% reduced cost, their mana cost multiplier would fall from 0.1 to 0, a 100% reduction. The same amount of that stat had a larger overall effect since the player started with more sources of the stat. In patch 3.29, GGG is moving away from this type of system. Items and passives that used to grant percent reduced costs will now grant between 2 and 3 times that amount of increased cost efficiency. The ratio between the old cost reductions and the new cost efficiency varies by item, but for the rest of this analysis we'll assume the low end and compare with a 2 times ratio to make the math neater. The new cost efficiency stat still stacks with itself additively, but unlike in the old system, cost efficiency modifies skill cost in the inverse. To find the final cost of a skill, you now take the base cost and divide it by 1 plus the sum of all increased cost efficiency modifiers. As shown in this new chart, there will now be an inverse relationship between a player's cost efficiency and their skill's mana cost multiplier. Let's compare these two systems at a few points. Small investments, the new cost efficiency system will be more impactful than the old. Under the old system, going from 0 to 10% reduced cost dropped the player's mana multiplier from 1 to 0.9. That source of 10% reduced cost will now roughly grant 20% cost efficiency under the new system, dropping the player's mana multiplier instead from 1 to 0.83. However, at large investments, the new cost efficiency system has diminishing returns. As you stack more and more cost efficiency, each subsequent point has less of an impact than the previous one. No matter how much cost efficiency you get, you won't be able to entirely eliminate skill costs without flat reductions. Finally, look what happens as cost efficiency becomes negative. Skill costs rise very rapidly compared to the old system. We know from patch notes that cost efficiency will be available on rings from the crafting bench and from unveiled modifiers. In theory, it should be possible to use a reflecting mist on a ring with one of these modifiers. One of the outcomes from that reflecting mist would be a ring having a cost efficiency mod that was negated, granting reduced cost efficiency. Furthermore, the reflecting mist multiplies the scale of the cost efficiency modifier at the same time. This is speculation, but a single well-rolled ring could provide as much as 20 to 25% reduced cost efficiency. Wearing 2 of these rings, or even 3 with the Nameless bloodline, could push a player all the way to the left of this chart, multiplying their skill costs by more than 2.5 times. This would be consequential for some niche builds which scale their damage based on skill costs. We'll discuss these in a bit, but first, one more observation. While GGG is changing all sources of reduced cost, there's nothing in the patch notes about existing sources of increased cost. It's not a particularly common stat, but unless there are undocumented changes, you should still be able to get increased cost of skills from, for example, the Forethought notable on the passive tree, transforming other notables with a Fevered Mind Jewel, or using uniques like Jaquani's Potential or Replica Lavianja's Spirit. So, why is this important? In the past, as discussed, increased and reduced cost of skills stacked additively with each other. However, with the new cost efficiency system, increased cost of skills will now interact multiplicatively with cost efficiency. A skill's final cost multiplier will be found by multiplying the base cost by 1 plus the sum of all increased cost modifiers, then dividing by the sum of all increased efficiency modifiers. This opens up a new avenue for scaling. Let's add a new axis to our graphs of cost multipliers. These new graphs put increased cost of skills on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, I'm showing reduced cost of skills or cost efficiency as appropriate for before and after patch 3.29. The color scale is the same on both charts, with a cost multiplier of 1 being shown as green. As the cost multiplier increases, the color becomes more red, and as the multiplier decreases, it becomes more blue. Looking at the chart on the left, we see the expected additive relationship between the increased and reduced costs. For example, if you walk up 50% on the vertical axis, this is perfectly offset by an equivalent amount of scaling on the horizontal axis. The final cost multiplier is 1 under the old mana cost system. But now, compare this same example with the new mana cost efficiency system. Going up to 50% on the vertical axis and then getting an equivalent amount of mana cost efficiency results in a final cost multiplier of 0.75. The multiplicative relationship between increased cost and increased efficiency results in an overall reduction in your final mana multiplier relative to the old pre-patch system. Why does this matter? Well, consider Indigon as a prime example of an item that interacts with skill costs to provide players damage. This unique helmet drops from the Uber Elder fight and is primarily used by mana stackers. Its primary effect are these 2 lines, which provide ramping effects based on the amount of mana spent in the past 4 seconds. The first line, 50 to 60% increased cost of skills for each 200 total mana spent recently, grants the player a substantial multiplier to their skill costs. As you spend more mana, these skill cost increases stack with themselves additively. This tends to create a feedback loop where spending mana causes your mana costs to go up, which makes you spend even more mana, making your mana costs go up even further, and the cycle repeats. The payoff comes on the second line, which grants up to 25% increased spell damage for every 200 mana spent in the last 4 seconds. As you spend mana and your costs go up, so will your damage multiplier. You can very rapidly burn through a large mana pool this way, but put out a lot of damage while you do. The problem is that you have to be able to sustain those costs. Under the old mana cost system, Indigon would stack up a huge amount of increased cost. Trying to offset that with reduced cost was a losing battle. Increases and reductions add together, and the Indigon increases far outweighed any reductions you could get elsewhere on gear. This led to very bursty damage on Indigon builds. You'd start at low damage, but casting skills would ramp that damage up quickly. However, then you'd run out of mana and your damage would fall off. Under the new system, however, it could be reasonable to try to offset Indigon cost increases with mana cost efficiency, since the two quantities are multiplicative. It will be far easier now to balance your mana spend rate to maintain a manageable number of Indigon stacks without your skill costs scaling uncontrollably. While Indigon interacted with skill costs to provide percent damage increases, there are also several mechanics which instead add base damage to skills depending on their costs. The Hand of the Fervent unique gloves are a reward from Ritual that grants you the buff Sacrificial Zeal when you use a skill. The Sacrificial Zeal buff grants added spell physical damage equal to 25% of the skill's mana cost, but also causes you to take physical damage over time proportional to that skill's cost. If you can tolerate the physical degen, it can be beneficial to scale up your mana costs in order to maximize the added damage from the Sacrificial Zeal buff. Similarly, Unlight Silhouette from the Nameless Bloodline gives skills added chaos damage equal to 25% of their life cost. You can scale up your skill mana costs using increased cost of skills or reduced mana cost efficiency, and then convert those to life costs with life tap support in order to gain a large amount of flat chaos damage. The larger the life cost, the more flat damage you receive. In both of these cases, you're incentivized to scale up your skill costs. As mentioned before, you could use reflected cost efficiency jewelry to rapidly scale those costs. This can be taken a step further by combining reduced cost efficiency with increased mana costs. Since these quantities are multiplicative with each other, any investment into one makes investment into the other even more effective. Just refer to our chart of cost multipliers to see how quickly costs scale up as you move towards the upper left of the chart. At face value, skill mana costs may just seem like a problem to be solved in a build, but with a little bit of creativity you can use some niche mechanics to make skill costs instead be build enabling. I've created a few builds that revolve entirely around abusing skill costs. In Freesia 2.0, I made a mana stacking character that completely removed mana costs, letting me use Archmage with a channeling skill. On the other hand, in Mirage League, I made a life stacker that gave Tempest Shield a huge life cost in order to get the flat damage from Unlight Silhouette while only having to pay that cost once, resulting in Thorns-like gameplay. I hope that this video has given you some ideas of tech that you can work into your own builds. If you enjoyed the video, you can support the channel by subscribing and leaving a comment to boost it in the algorithm. Let me know if there's any cost scaling mechanics that you think can be abused with the new systems in patch 3.29. Thank you for your support.